Hi, in this video, we will see how to achieve GitOps on AWS EKS with using Flux CD. So as you see in this PPT depicts my demo. Here we will see how to install Flux on Amazon EKS, which is managed Kubernetes cluster. And then we will see how to configure the Flux CD or Flux application on Amazon EKS so that it does the continuous deployment from GitHub repository, which is acting as a the source of truth for the application desired state on Amazon EKS. So here we will see what are all the prerequisites that is required to install the Flux on AWS EKS cluster. Then we will see how to install it, how to configure it, and we also see how to reconcile it so that it actually scrapes the desired state that is defined on the GitHub and applies the same on the AWS EKS. Alright, so this video will be a purely hands-on experiencing lab session. So as you see here, I'm currently in my AWS account. I have already created a cluster, AWS EKS cluster Flux demo, and I have a repository as well in the another tab. So this is my GitHub repository which I'm using for this particular demo purpose. So since here the prerequisite is also that you need to have a repository as well, because that's where the Flux will use that GitHub repository source code as a reference and try to maintain that desired state on the AWS EKS cluster. So this is my GitHub repository. Okay, so basically these are all the prerequisites. Now let me take you to my VS Code. So this is my VS Code, and here I have already cloned that repository which I have just now shown you. So that is AWS EKS Flux GitOps. So in this repository I have a file called readme.md file. So in that file I have documented the steps that you need to follow to enable or to install the Flux CD on AWS EKS cluster, how to configure it, how to use it. So all those steps are been documented here. Now, as part of this demo, what I did is I have created the cluster which I shown you from the scratch, and the cluster is fresh. It does not has any installation for your information. So what I do is, I'm going to quickly walk you through the, how did I do that configurations on the AWS EKS cluster, which actually installed the, installs the Flux on the EKS cluster. So here there are multiple prerequisites. One is your system need to have AWS CLI. Your system need to have the kubectl installed in your system. You should have the Flux CLI. Okay, so remember that Flux application also provides a CLI through which you can interact with the Flux application hosted on the EKS cluster. Okay, so you need to have the Flux CLI installed in your system so that you can use the Flux command line utility. Right, so those are all the prerequisites. Basically you need to use it here. And one more is, here we are using eksctl to create a cluster. So if you want to create a cluster with using eksctl, you need to have this eksctl installed in your system. So first command is basically all those commands that I'm walking you through now. Those commands are already been documented in this readme.md file. So I'm going to share this repositories link where you can find this readme.md file and try to use it from your side. Alright, so what I do is now I'm going to walk you through these commands and show you that how does that it behave and how does it go, does the respective jobs, and we will also see that real time how does this Flux helps us to achieve the continuous deployment on Amazon EKS cluster. So we run the command that is AWS configure, which is actually setting the AWS context, or basically setting the AWS account context with using AWS access key ID, secret access key, and then we are providing the region name and default output format. So then I'm running one more command to validate whether I have set my AWS account context or not by running the command AWS STS get caller identity, and it has written something like this. So the next command is basically the command where I have run this command to create my EKS cluster, which I shown you. So command is eksctl create cluster, and I have fed in this this cluster.yaml file. So this is where we have defined how does my cluster has to look in. It contains a manage node groups with these configurations and then the other default definitions. Alright, so when I run this command, it has took almost more than so basically more than 15 minutes if I'm not wrong. So it has created me a cluster, and it also has updated the kubeconfig file in this terminal session so that I can interact with the EKS cluster API server. So to validate whether the cluster is up and running fine and API server is able to listen our command, so that is why reason I just executed a command called kubectl get nodes, which will return something like this, which means that you have your terminal has an access to your EKS cluster API server, and then you can go ahead with the next command executions. So next command is basically, so the next command is you need to have the namespace created in your EKS cluster. So I'm running a kubectl create namespace a Flux system. So we are creating a namespace with the name called Flux system. So that namespace has been created here. And then, the next command is to actually check the prerequisite that is required to install the Flux on EKS cluster. So you run a command called Flux check prerequisite. Okay, so remember that installing the Flux on your EKS cluster is one-time job, and then later, it will continue to operate as a CD tool, continuous deployment tool, or basically act as a tool which enables you to achieve the GitOps. So basically, GitOps means it's a methodology where you consider GitHub repository as the source of truth to maintain the desired state on the targeted host. It could be EKS cluster, it could be virtual machine, it could be anything, right? And in between basically the orchestrator here is the Flux application that is installed on the EKS cluster. Okay, so that is basically under the hood definition of what is the GitOps does in this context. And then we are setting the environmental variable. So now let me take you ahead with the next command, that is we need to set an environmental variable called Flux system. And then so then you actually do run the next command, which is basically very, very important command here. So the command is Flux bootstrap GitHub, right? Okay, so this is the command which actually installs the Flux application on EKS, and then you are configuring that application so that it can actually configure the destination repository, or basically source repository, from where it can download the the desired state definition and apply on the EKS cluster. Okay, remember that Flux CD is not an application, it is an infrastructure orchestrator which actually maintains a desired state of your application that you want to host on the EKS cluster. So here this is Flux bootstrap GitHub. So basically we are using the GitHub, and then you need to give the owner name. Okay, so how do you get this owner name? If I go to the GitHub repository, so you have a github.com, and then whatever you see after that is basically owner name, and then this is your repository name. Okay, so these are all the data we need to construct this command. So I'm just selecting this command quickly. So here this is my owner name, this is my repository name, then in that one I'm choosing the main branch, and then within this within this repository I have a folder called apps. So if I minimize this, so in this repository I have a folder called apps. Underneath the apps, we have a folder again called UI. Okay, so that is where my application's desired state, are basically a collection of manifest files are being kept underneath that. Okay, that is what I'm giving it here, that is nothing but apps. Okay, and then we are using the personal basically. So once I run this command, it will ask you to provide the pat token, because remember that so the Flux application is sitting on a EKS cluster, which is basically an completely isolated environment. It needs to download the files and folders present in the GitHub repository. So to do that, it needs to have an authentication. So for that case, we need to have a pat token. To create a pat token, what you can do is you can go to the repository like this and go to the here you can go to the settings. Once you go to the settings, basically go to the developer settings. From the developer setting, you go to the the personal access token, and then here you can use fine grained token or access token. So I'm using the classic token for now. So I created a Flux demo token by clicking on this one, that is basically generate token. Here it will ask me for provide the credentials, which I'm not going to provide, but basically, so likewise, if you follow that, you will end up with creating a pat token and you will get that ID. So that ID should be given here in the in this pat token. Okay, so once you give that, if you see that the down the line, you will start executing the backend processes. So when I say backend processes at a high level, what happens is when you run this command on the GitHub on your AWS EKS cluster, you will install an application called Flux. In that application, you will you do a configuration of that particular application, saying like, hey, this is my repository, this is my branch, and this is my folder where I will keep my application's desired state. And you need to scrape those basically you need to download those information and apply it on the Kubernetes cluster and maintain the desired state of my application infrastructure, like that. All right, so that is what it is actually doing. It actually clones the repository. If you see here, you can follow these commands one after to other, try to understand what is it happening under the hood. So at the end, you see that all components are healthy. That's what you need to see. Okay, so with this state, what you have done is you have actually set the Flux configuration on the EKS cluster. Now once the Flux has been set, you need to actually do one more step, that is basically further configure it so that it can scrape the basically it can scrape the the desired state that is kept in the GitHub repository in a basically a required manner, and then try to apply it on the Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so that definition will be explained or basically defined in a basically the declarative language. Again, we will have a file called apps.yaml file. So I'm going to walk you through this apps.yaml file, which is actually configuring the Flux application post you install it. Okay, so at this stage you install it. Now next step is you need to customly configure it. So for that case, what we need is we need an YAML file, which is basically again a manifest file for the configuring the the Flux application on the EKS cluster. So this file, if I quickly walk you through this one, so this file is creating a two objects of Flux, right? So Flux CD, one is GitHub repository object, the other one is customization object. So if I can explain what is the GitHub repository object, is basically this is kind of a the object created by Flux CD, where this object has a information about what is the repository that it has to script or it has to reference for the manifest files or desired state files in the bracket. Then what is a branch, and which are all this the reference. Okay, so if you see here now, as per my explanation, you can try to understand this. Okay, so here it has a metadata information, it has the interval, it has the the SSH URL. So this SSH URL of GitHub repository, you can find it from your repository. So if you go to your repository back, and then so if you go to this repository particularly, so here in the code you have the SSH. Okay, this is the URL that we have kept here, and then in the reference, so we are referencing to branch main. Secret reference, that is nothing but if you have a secret is needed, so you can keep it the secret here as well. And then the next object is basically customization. So customization is nothing but I can say that this is basically this is the mode through which Flux CD tries to achieve the the scraping of desired state definition, or basically a group of manifest file, and then how to deploy that on the EKS cluster. Okay, so in the sense, from where to scrape it and where to deploy it, how to deploy it, all those the activity channelization will be done by this object, that is customization. Okay, and basically so basically you can consider that this is kind of an object which is actually connecting the dots, like it is helping the Flux CD to do all those, like downloading the desired state file, installing the desired state file on the Kubernetes, on the EKS, like that. All right, so for now you can understand it as it is. So we are creating an object like customization, this is metadata, and then here if you see here, so here it is using the repository. From the repository, if you see here, there is no definition of from this repository which folder I need to go and search for the desired state files, or basically manifest file that will be defined in this customization. Okay, so if you see here, it is says interval 5, in the sense so what is the the threshold or basically polling interval that Flux has to keep polling to check whether there is any change in this particular files present under this particular folder. So here we have a apps, right? So if I minimize this one, you see that we have an apps folder, that is what we have given a path. Pern is basically we have to keep it true, and then the source reference, if you see the source reference, it is actually the source reference, it will inherit from the whatever you have defined in the object called that is GitHub repository. All right, and then these are all the namespace and the name definitions you have given. So with this, basically what you are doing is here is, till now I believe that you have got it, that so this is the file which is actually configures the Flux CD post installation, and it will direct the Flux CD that to actually scrape the files from this repository, this folder, like that. So you can apply that by running a command kubectl apply -f apps.yaml file. Remember that for a static repository, this is the one-time job. If your repository folder structure are keep dynamic, then you might need to keep applying it often. But at a rarest case, at enterprise grade, you also need to do it only one time. So once you run this one, so basically it gets configured like this. You can ignore the warning, but warnings can also be solved by another method if you can explore on this one, on these informations. And then next command is basically to check get the customization, right? So what did we do now? So we actually deployed the GitHub repository object, we deployed the customization object, right? Now you need to get what happened to that particular object, that you can run a Flux CLI commands to get the information, that is Flux get customization. So this is where you are getting the output, and then you run the command, that is kubectl get ns. So basically kubectl get namespaces, these are all nothing but your namespaces. right? So once you run the kubectl namespaces, you should able to see a namespace that is UI Flux system. Okay, so if you see here, we have a Flux system and UI are the the other than default namespaces that is being created here, right? And then I'm gonna explain the what are all the objects that are present underneath the apps folder, and that is actually acting as a template that how you need to define your manifest file or basically desired state file of your application. Okay, so for now, I will let me go back and try to explain you what is that contained underneath the apps. Then we're gonna continue the next commands explanations here. All right. So what we do is now we are here and we have checked the namespaces. Okay. So once I did the apply, that is apply.apps.yaml file. What happens is basically, so you have dictated a Flux CD to say that hey, this is my repository, this is my path. You need to maintain the basically you need to use the GitOps method and try to maintain the desired state. That's what you have declared here. So in this situation, when you run this particular command, what happens is, as soon as the Flux CD gets configured, it will go ahead and look at the upstream. So this is basically my VS Code environment, which is downstream in the sense it is not yet synced with the upstream. So if I go to the upstream, which is nothing but GitHub application. So in this repository, we have the apps. So in this apps, okay, now what I do is, I'm going to explain the content of this particular file from here only. So if I go to the customization, basically underneath the app, you have one file called customization, which actually dictates, how does the configuration, further configuration has to be orchestrated. So here again, we are using the object that is called customization underneath the Flux CD, and it is pointing to a resource. What is that resource? Is nothing but, where this customization has to go and look for the further manifest files. Those manifest files are sit under UI. Remember that this resource is nothing but, it will always point to a folder. So in this context of this apps folder, where is the UI folder? This is my UI folder. It will go underneath this. So if you see here, this folder contains a very known .yaml file or basically manifest file, right? You might have heard config.map, deployment, namespaces, services, service account. Okay, so these are all as the names of this file says. So basically the respective file will create the respective Kubernetes objects. So if I go to the config map, it is creating a config map of the Kubernetes, context. And then in the deployment, it is actually deploying an application, which is an example application which I have taken. You can go through this file as well. In the customization, remember that customization underneath the UI folder, you will also have a one more customization. So this is again a one more, the Flux CD context object, so which is called customization. In this one, it is actually creating a namespace called UI. Remember that we are actually declaring a file called namespace.yaml file where the namespace gets created, and then it is telling that which resources it has to point in. So it has a namespace.yaml, config.yaml. So basically, it is actually listing all other files. So we have 5 files, and all the 5 files are been listed here. Right, the first file that it gets executed is basically namespace.yaml. Okay, so if I go here, so in this namespace, it is basically it's creating a Kubernetes namespace object. So underneath that namespace, we are actually creating this deployment, and then we are actually out of that deployment, we are actually creating the service actually, and then for dummy sake, we are actually creating the service account. Okay, just to mimic the scenarios. Okay. So this is what it contains underneath the UI folder. For now, you can ignore the Flux system. That is nothing to worry about. You can just ignore it. Now let me go back to the VS Code. So if I go to the VS Code, then that's the reason. Okay, so once we did the kubectl apply apps.yaml file, which means that it has scraped the data that is present underneath this upstream branches or upstream GitHub repository, right? And then so then when you run the command that is kubectl get ns, that's the reason where you see that you have the namespace called UI got created. Remember that I have not created UI namespace in this context. Okay, I'm showing you the terminal as it is, as I was executing. So in the sense, it has created the namespace for your information, and then we are actually, so I went through that namespace and got try to get the pods. If it has created pods, I see that pods are already been created, and then again I was curious, and do you is it created a service as well? So then again I see that service is also been created. All right, then I wanted to access that service with using port forwarding method. That's what I did here. That is, I run a command called kubectl port forwarding to the namespace called UI, and I want to do a port forwarding for the service that is nothing but this SVC service with the name like UI, yeah, on port number basically 8080. Now if I copy this particular, the local address, local host address, and try to search here, you are seeing that the application is running, right? So remember that this is the magic happened, right? Basically I just installed Flux CD with a definition or with a configuration, or basically with a declarative configuration saying that hey, this is my repository, this is my path of the repository, this is my branch, where you need to scrape and install the the application on this cluster in a GitOps method. And then the Flux CD has done it. Okay, now application is working fine, blah blah everything. Okay, so with this, what I can show is that so basically this is how the GitOps works. Okay, so basically we have till now we have learned the step number 1. The step number 2 is how does that it maintains the GitOps lifecycle. So basically GitOps lifecycle is nothing but so here in the GitOps methodology, you consider the source code that is kept in the GitHub repository as a source of truth of desired state of your application, state that has to be hosted on a Kubernetes cluster, that is AWS EKS here, right? So now we will see how does that it actually maintains. Okay, for that case what I do is, for now I'm going to terminate this particular port forwarding, and we go to the next command which I'm going to show you now. Okay, so there is a slight difference between the definition that I have in the upstream with the downstream. Okay, so downstream is nothing but it's a cloned copy of whatever I have in the GitHub repository. So if I show you now, what I did is, instead of that application, I'm now deploying the Nginx, right? So instead of pointing to this, if I go back to the repository here and go to the apps, and then go to the UI folder and go to the deployment. So here we are having some retail application, the app, it's pointing to retail application, but here I want to change it to the normal Nginx application. So how does that happen? It has to happen automatically if I sync it. Remember that I'm not syncing here. Okay, so there is a one more custom command called flux reconcile source GitHub. Okay, this is the forcible you can reconcile it. If I reconcile it here again, so what happens is basically it will again script the data from the whatever the data that is present in the GitHub application repository, that is only will be script. But whatever we have in the VS code which is about to be synced to the upstream, right? That's the reason it will not take it, right? So looks like it has synced it. And if I try to again do a port forwarding on this particular on this particular service, and if I go ahead and try to refresh the same path, right? So let me remove this basically and try to rerun it. Here you go, it is again standing on the retail sample application. Okay, now what we do is basically I'm going to kill it off, and now I'm going to commit these changes, in the sense now we, instead of that application, I replaced with the another application on a same page. Okay, remember that we are changing on a deployment.yaml file, and we are changing the service definition. Okay, other app, other configuration file I'm not touching, because these are all the two manifest file which applies for the application definition or application deployment. Now let me make changes, or basically do a upstream sync, and then that's where the Flux CD has to automatically find out that there is a something merged into the repository, into the branch, and then it has to automatically sync the changes to the AWS EKS cluster and maintain the desired state, and finally achieve the GitOps operations there. So I will call it as a demo sync, basically demo updated changes, and I'm gonna commit it now and resync it basically, right? So once you sync it, so once it is synced, basically it's synced now. You can actually watch what is happening on the customization. I know whether the customization is syncing the changes from the latest pushes on the GitHub repository. That you can check it by running the command called flux get customization watch. So if you watch it here, so let me make it big. There should be there should be a couple of logs getting populated here. If you see here, you see that it has automatically identified that there are something has been pushed on that particular repository, and it has reconciled it. If you see here, it has reconciled it. Okay, and that is what I wanted to show you now. Now once this is reconciled, I'm expecting that something has to be changed. So let me make the changes, and let's go and try to get the pods now. So if I deploy the get pods from the UI application, here you go, right? So earlier, if I go above and get the pods definition here, so kubectl get pods from the UI, earlier it was name was something different, right? Now if I go ahead, you see that the name got changed to Nginx. Why? Because now we have deployed the Nginx application instead of some other retail application. Right now, let me try to see the what about the service as well. So does the service got changed? Yes, of course, service has to be changed. Let's try to see what happened to the service as well. So let me let me do that get service from the UI namespace. All right, and here you go. Right, so it also has changed the service. Now let's do a port forwarding. Okay, so when you do a port forwarding, remember that you need to give the name as per this particular nginx. Okay, so if you give svs, it will not work, right? So if you give svs/ui, it will not work because the service name is nginx-service. So I'm going to change that now to this service, and I'm going to do a port forwarding now. So we are doing a port forwarding on nginx, so we should see our nginx application responding now. So let me basically I'm waiting for this to get responded. Right, so basically there is looks to be some TLS handshake error. We need to go on a mute for some time. We're gonna go on a pause and come back again. Okay, so I did not do anything because looks like the application was might be setting the maybe the the pod was under basic liveliness probe, right? Basically it was about to complete the liveliness cycle. That's the reason it was not responded when we did this. But now looks like it is responding, and we can try to access this application and check if it really works now. Okay, so now instead of this file, you should see the nginx file. So now it is nginx file. Okay, now I have, so basically you see that there is a sudden changes in the sense, see basically what happening is the git with using the GitOps methodology, the Flux is actually scraping the data that is getting pushed under on the GitHub repository and maintaining that state on the EKS cluster. All right, so with add note, I have shown you the things need to be shown in this video from scratch to end. Finally, a kind request, please do subscribe my channel. That would really encourage me a lot. With that note, thank you, thanks a lot, and see you in the next video.